Alright YouTube, so we're back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy, but also we're discussing Square Enix here and the potential for an acquisition. This is a pretty popular topic, it's been around for quite some time. I've seen it more recently in the last few months. And the topic resurfaced here recently with Square Enix selling their Western studios, Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal and Square Enix Montreal for $300 million. The biggest part of the acquisition being the Tomb Raider franchise, but also Embracer received Legacy of Kain, and also Thief, and a back catalog of like 50 different games and a bunch of staff. So that, of course, has people talking about the potential Sony acquisition of Square Enix again, and it's something I've wanted to talk about for quite a while, but now that this has happened, it kind of sparked me to want to finally make the video, and I think now the fact that they're selling any sort of studios, it certainly seems possible. Obviously, they're in the market to sell shit since they sold their Western developers. There's also the possibility that if they're going to be acquired, that maybe like Sony acquiring them only wants the big shit, like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and Kingdom Hearts and all that other like shit that really makes money. And Tomb Raider's not as big as it used to be, right? The newer games were pretty good. I played the reboot, the first one. I didn't play any other games in the reboot series. But that first Tomb Raider game was really, really good. But yeah, just a bit of like a tinfoil hat theory here, but maybe if Sony is acquiring Square Enix, they just want the quote-unquote good stuff, right? They want the big money makers, and they didn't give a shit about the rest, and the bloat, so to speak. Now, in regards to this video and talking about the potential of an acquisition, we're mostly going to be discussing the Final Fantasy franchise. Of course, that's what we talk about here, but again, it includes all the other big franchises that Square Enix has, all the big money makers. And the possibility of Sony acquiring them, I mean, it just makes sense, right? They've had a working relationship with Sony for such a long time. You know, some years ago, they had stuff like World of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age that was exclusive to PlayStation. Eventually, it did come to Xbox. And more recently, we had Remake being a timed exclusive, but it was a pretty long timed exclusive. It was like a year and a half or some shit. But even still now, in terms of consoles, you can still only get it on the PlayStation platform, but you can also buy it on PC. And upcoming, we have stuff like Final Fantasy 16, which is going to be PS5 exclusive, probably also timed to some degree, and eventually come to PC. At this point, I'm not sure what they're doing with the Final Fantasy franchise and Xbox, because we ain't heard shit in a long time. And then also Remake Part 2, of course, is going to be PS5 exclusive for probably a set amount of time as well. So it seems like, I mean, as of right now, for the last couple of years, you know, the Final Fantasy franchise is PlayStation exclusive, so an acquisition just kind of makes sense. But also, an acquisition just kind of makes sense on Sony's end because presumably they've been paying Square Enix a shit ton of money to keep their games exclusive, and you wouldn't have to do that if you owned them. Also, if Sony were to acquire Square Enix, they'd be getting their hands on what is probably the biggest MMO in the world right now with Final Fantasy XIV. Like, there's other MMOs out there like World of Warcraft that have more total players, like 100 million players, but also, how long has World of Warcraft been around, and how many of those people are actually active? Because active players for World of Warcraft are like 1 million something, and usually Final Fantasy XIV is like upwards of close to 2 million. And speaking of exclusivity, like a minute ago, Final Fantasy XIV, in terms of consoles, is only on the PlayStation platform. You can get it on PC, of course, but if you're going to play it on a console, you gotta buy a PlayStation. So, again, it just makes sense if Sony were to acquire it. I think it's probably why this discussion's been around for such a long time. Now, one of the kind of obvious negatives in terms of Sony acquiring Square Enix is the possibility of a lot of their games becoming exclusive to the platform. But if we're discussing just Final Fantasy, as we've already discussed here in the video, that's kind of already the case. Now, you could certainly be worried about like other franchises going forward, like Kingdom Hearts or like Nier or whatever the case, Dragon Quest, like those becoming PlayStation exclusive, which is certainly a worry. I'm not the biggest fan of exclusive. I've talked about this a lot on my channel over the last however many years I've been doing YouTube. I'm just not a fan of exclusives. I get them, I understand them, I know why they are a thing. I'm just not a fan of it. I just think it's kind of ridiculous. And unless like the platform is paying you insane amounts of money, you gotta be losing money by keeping it on like one platform, right? That seems to make sense in my head. Now, in the discussion of Sony acquiring Square Enix and how much they potentially have to pay for that, it's kind of hard to get a definitive answer because I see conflicting numbers everywhere when I'm trying to look up the value of something like Square Enix. But from what I've seen in the past, I've seen it be valued at under Bethesda, which Bethesda was like $3 billion at the time, rather, whenever it was acquired. But, you know, in 2022, I'm seeing that, you know, Square Enix is worth upwards of like $6 billion. But even putting that aside, you know, Microsoft acquired ZeniMax, which was Bethesda, and all the other game studios under Bethesda for like $7.5 billion, which is still more than what Square Enix is worth. So, but if they're trying to, you know, acquire Square Enix as a whole, they'd probably have to pay over that, right? However many billions over that. So potentially the acquisition could be bigger than the Microsoft Bethesda acquisition or Microsoft ZeniMax, however you want to look at it. But still, I'd say it'd be somewhere within the same ballpark as the Bethesda acquisition, maybe give or take a few billion. Now, in a hypothetical situation of Square Enix being acquired and a lot of their franchises becoming exclusive, for me personally, as much as that would suck for other people, it doesn't really affect me too much. Like, I don't play a lot of the Square Enix games. It's mostly Final Fantasy here. I played a little bit of Kingdom Hearts. I played some of the Dragon Quest games, Just Cause and other things that are underneath the Square Enix umbrella. But for the most part, I've played like all of the Final Fantasy games, and as we've discussed multiple times in this video, more or less the franchise these days is PlayStation exclusive. So in that regard, nothing really changes for me. But if you look at something like, you know, Final Fantasy VII Remake and also Final Fantasy XIV, those are PlayStation exclusive games that are also on PC. So inevitably, anything that would be PlayStation exclusive under Square Enix, under Sony, would inevitably probably still come to PC anyway. So it'd really just be a console exclusive thing. So it'd just be like Nintendo users and Xbox users missing out. At the end of the day, man, an acquisition of Square Enix is going to be a big deal. And more than likely, some of their franchises are going to be exclusive. Because in the early days of the Bethesda acquisition, they were kind of on the fence about it. They didn't really want to like tell you what was going on. But, you know, these days are seemingly more or less confirming stuff like Starfield and potentially Elder Scrolls 6 and things like that being Xbox exclusive games. And I would see, you know, Sony doing the same thing if they were to acquire Square Enix. But ultimately, my dudes, those are just my thoughts on the topic. I do think that Sony buying Square Enix is kind of inevitable at some point. Now, it's hard to say if it's going to be anytime soon, later this year, next year, 2 years from now. I don't know, right? But I do think it's going to happen at some point. And I do think that Square Enix selling off some of their Western studios, or all the Western studios, whatever it is kind of a tell in some ways of the future, so to speak. Either way, dudes, that is going to be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys already want to see more potential of Sony buying Square Enix news. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @DaveYT. I'm a Discord. Links to the are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.